What does it take to be a scientific pioneer? To reframe and popularize evolutionary theory. To reveal a new material and win science's most coveted prize. Or discover one of paleontology's elusive missing links. Is the key to brilliance pure talent, ego, or just plain good luck? What makes a beautiful scientific mind? Professor Richard Dawkins is amongst Britain's most outspoken and prolific scientific thinkers.
I don't think he's quite in the Oxford English Dictionary yet, but it's almost at that level.
In the 1970s, he made his name with an explosive book that turned evolutionary thinking on its head.
It was a wonderful and radical new vision set out in sparkling prose, and above it all, this wonderful, wonderful metaphor, the selfish gene.
The book propelled him into the spotlight and gave Dawkins a platform to speak out as a ferocious critic of religion.
Lord Jakobowicz is an educated man. He knows perfectly well the world was not created in 6 days.
Richard gives definitive answers to things. If you don't like those answers, you're going to find it controversial, you're not going to like him.
Sir, there could be many things that you know well, but please, in the process of it, don't be arrogant.
How did Richard Dawkins become the most influential evolutionary thinker of a generation? And how did this lead him to assume the mantle of evangelical spokesman for atheism?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins' public career spans 4 decades. Since the publication of his global bestseller, The Selfish Gene, he has penned a further 10 books, written hundreds of articles, and become a well-known TV personality.
Would you please welcome Professor Richard Dawkins? Please welcome Professor Richard Dawkins.
His message about science is simple.
I try to emphasize that science is magical in the best sense of being spellbinding, spine-crawling, exciting, magical in that sense.
His thinking is defined by logic and by an insistence on scientific evidence.
To say, I don't understand X, therefore it must be magic, or therefore it must be supernatural, it must be a miracle, that's cowardly and defeatist, lazy. And I try to rather strongly make the case against that. You have to be open and constantly questioning and using the methods of science to try to find out what's really true.
A zoologist by training, Richard Dawkins has spent a lifetime questioning the mechanisms of the natural world. As a child of keen naturalists, biology was practically in his DNA.
I grew up in what was then Nyasaland, now Malawi, until I was 7. Both my parents loved flowers when my sister and I were young, and when we went on walks, they would constantly be telling us the names of all the wildflowers, my father in Latin, my mother in English. And so we both of us had every opportunity to love nature.
Perhaps surprisingly, Richard did not share his family's passion for animals and plants.
I suppose it should have been a paradise for a young naturalist, and I did enjoy what I saw, and I loved butterflies and birds and things, but I never really developed properly into a young naturalist. I think perhaps a bit to the disappointment of my father, who always was, and his father, my grandfather. I remember on a visit to England, which we occasionally did, my grandfather looked out of the window and asked me whether I could identify a bird that was on the bird table. I hadn't the faintest idea. So I said, "Is it a chaffinch?" And grandfather was absolutely shocked that I didn't know that it was a blue-tit.
Instead, Richard showed signs of being a different kind of thinker, one who was more interested in ideas than in outdoor life.
I loved reading, and I used to read in a rather sort of clandestine way, both at school and at home. At school, I used to sort of disappear when I was supposed to be using my hands in the workshops and things like that and read. And at home, I used to sort of sneak up to my bedroom and read when I was really supposed to be out in the big outdoors.
The natural order of things came alive to Richard not through country walks, but in the pages of Hugh Lofting's Dr. Dolittle books.
Dr. Dolittle is rather like Charles Darwin on the Beagle. All the plots of the Dr. Dolittle books concern animals and animal welfare, really, and I think that really did influence me in the direction of having a great sympathy for non-human animals. When I learned about evolution, I became even more aware of the continuity, as Darwin very much was, the continuity between humans and other animals. And we are African apes, and we're rather a recent offshoot from other African apes. And so the sort of great moral and political barrier that we tend to erect around Homo sapiens, as an evolutionist I can see is not logical. And as a child, I was kind of schooled into by Dr. Dolittle.
Though Darwin's theory of natural selection would come to form the bedrock of Richard's science, as a child, he did not immediately grasp it.
I'm not sure that I really got it, actually. I think I sort of misunderstood it. I didn't really think it was up to the job of explaining all of life.
It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds and with various insects flitting about, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms have all been produced by laws acting around us.
To Richard, natural selection appeared to be inadequate because Darwin's idea was so simple.
Darwin's original argument was that species produce more offspring than can survive to adulthood. And among those offspring, it's not random who survives, but larger ones survive, or ones who are somehow better fitted to survive and to reproduce do.
As the fitter individuals reproduce, their characteristics are transmitted to their young, whilst the less fit individuals perish or leave behind fewer offspring.
As those forces work through down the generations, those that have the characteristics that better enable them to survive will do so and will be more represented in the generations.
Natural selection takes place slowly, through tiny incremental changes, over vast spans of time. Richard would be in his teens before he really took this in.
It was probably my father who explained it to me so that I first got it, and then fairly gradually became aware that Darwinian natural selection really was not just big enough, but hugely big enough. I mean, it was a really gigantically good idea.
Aged 13, the bookish Richard went to Oundle School in Northamptonshire. Here he met Mr. Thomas, a teacher who would shape his approach to scientific thinking.
He was an inspired teacher. He clearly was inspired by the living world, and he spoke with great passion and poetry, really, of what a marvelous subject biology is and how much it would encompass.
Ewan Thomas taught his class to rigorously question scientific ideas. But Richard did not yet stand out amongst his classmates.
He wasn't a star pupil, but the group that I had were a lot of very able. It would be rather difficult to be a star amongst them. I think they were great fun to teach, and he was somebody who was fun to teach because he responded in the right sort of way. But he didn't look necessarily as being outstanding.
His parents became concerned that he was not applying himself enough to make the grade and get into the Oxford college they were set on.
I think I'm right in saying that 11 members of the Dawkins family went to Balliol College, Oxford, and it was my grandfather's great hope and my father's great hope that I would as well. So I was sort of automatically entered for Balliol, and my parents went to see Mr. Thomas to talk about it.
They did come to see me at where I was staying in Arundel, and I think I did say that, well, I don't think he's going to get to Balliol at this stage. He will get into Oxford, he won't get to Balliol.
But anyway, I applied to Balliol, and Mr. Thomas had me in his house for several evenings, I think about once a week, actually, for sort of extracurricular coaching.
And then the pace seemed to change, which was what my intention had been.
Spurred on by Mr. Thomas's hothousing, Richard rose to the challenge, and in 1959 he made it to Balliol College, where he would study zoology. Here, he entered a world where Darwin's theory was barely on the radar for academic biologists.
Darwin's theory has a curious history. People think of it as Darwin revealing it to the world in 1859, and then the origins sailing forth and Darwinian theory being on top of science ever since. It wasn't at all like that. It actually went through a great decline. It's sometimes called the eclipse of Darwinian theory. And that started around the time that Darwin died in 1882 and went on until really past the middle of the 20th century. And during that time, it was deeply misunderstood, often ignored and reviled, but when it was used, it was not understood how the logic of it worked.
As an undergraduate, Richard was less concerned with Darwin than with the meticulous detail of his weekly essays. He was developing a flair for writing and original thinking.
The topics we were given for our weekly essay could well have been very specialized, narrow topics, and we were given the latest research literature on that topic, went into the library, one of the finest libraries in the world, and spent a whole week immersing oneself in this topic. And I did that to such an extent that I would kind of sleep, eat and dream the topic, whatever it was. I never, ever just sort of produced a textbook answer. It was always my own take on something, which I absolutely adored. My tutors, they said they loved my essays. I don't know whether they were just being nice.
His talent for refining and communicating ideas caught the eye of one tutor in particular, world-renowned animal behaviorist Nico Tinbergen.
When I do this, you know at once what I mean. The angry face, the clenched fist, convey a mood of aggression. It's a simple form of communication.
Richard graduated in 1962, and Tinbergen was so impressed by his abilities that he agreed to take Richard on as a doctoral student.
I I then became a member of his group on animal behavior, and that was a big turning point in my life. I mean, before I had tutorials with Tinbergen, I'd been going to do something biochemical, which I know would not have suited me. And so I'm very, very glad that happened.
The doctoral subject Tinbergen set for Richard was the study of innate behavior in young animals, such as chicks. Richard immersed himself in the work.
At that time, the Animal Behaviour Group lived in and worked in an old Victorian house in North Oxford. It was one of those very vertical houses with 2 rooms on each floor. And my memory of Richard was as one of the sort of senior, perhaps slightly austere figures in the group, but absolutely remarkable for his clarity of thought and clarity of expression. And that was one of the things that struck me right from the very beginning.
The high spot of the week for me was the Friday night seminars, where we all gathered around, and Nico was there, and somebody gave a talk about their research. And Nico was quite relentless in his questioning.
And I can remember one of these weekly seminars where a very distinguished scientist from Bristol University called John Crook came in to give the seminar, and he got through the first sentence, and Nico stopped him and said, "What exactly do you mean by that?" whatever it is he'd said.
He never had a proper chair. He sat on an old orange box or something, chain smoking, rolling his own, chain smoking, getting up, pacing up and down, chain smoking, sitting on the old orange box, and interrupting quite frequently. Yeah, and then interrupt.
That insistence on absolute clarity of thought must have had an influence on Richard's thinking, certainly had an influence on my thinking. And so in a sense, Richard was following in the Tinbergen tradition.
I think I came away from that enormously enthused about science, about asking scientific questions, and feeling that science really was for me.
Richard had found his vocation at an exciting time. Zoologists were returning to Darwinian ideas and beginning to wrestle with the question of how natural selection really worked. They knew that evolution favored the survival and reproduction of the fittest, but the fittest what? The fittest individuals, groups, or species?
For Darwin, it was the individual. It is us. We reproduce. But in the 1960s, it became apparent that that view was not wholly adequate. It was very difficult to take that view and still account for some of the behaviors that we see out there in the natural world, especially altruistic behaviors. Behaviors where animals apparently sacrifice themselves for other animals. How could that be if individuals are programmed to survive and reproduce?
The answer for many biologists was that the fittest groups of organisms survived and reproduced. If one wildebeest behaved altruistically to take care of another wildebeest's infant, the whole group would be successful and altruism would blossom. But other biologists thought this approach illogical.
Let's imagine a hypothetical example where everybody in a group behaves altruistically, and let's say they give up their food for other people. But that one individual in that group now behaves differently, behaves selfishly. So instead of giving up food, it grabs food from others. And food translates into survival and reproduction. You play the tape forward through a few hundred generations, and what's happened, all the goody-goodies, the altruists who gave away their food, had been supplanted, replaced by the selfish individuals who scoffed the food and reproduced as a result.
An alternative theory was proposed by Bill Hamilton, an evolutionary biologist with a particular interest in social insects. He wanted to know why female worker insects take care of the colony when they have no chance of ever reproducing in their own right. He came to believe that the sterile workers were sacrificing themselves for the queen and male drones because they all contained the same genes. and he believed it was true not just of social insects, but of all biological organisms.
The main thrust was the idea that animals share genes with their relatives. So if I do something for my brother, let's say, then the genes that cause me to do it will survive in him. And so there is essentially a gene-centred process going on.
If we took a gene-centred view of the world, we could explain some of those behaviours. Because it is the case that although we have our genes aren't uniquely ours, we share them with our relatives.
What Bill Hamilton did in 1964 was to realise that what matters is not just reproduction, not just producing children, but assisting the survival of your own genes. Any gene that assists the survival of itself by working through sisters and brothers and nephews and nieces and so on, such a gene would propagate itself.
Though Bill Hamilton published his work in the mid-60s, it attracted little attention.
It was, I think, one of the most difficult papers to follow that has ever been written. So, although the paper was there, it wasn't having much impact.
But Richard, now lecturing for Tinbergen at Oxford, had found his way through Hamilton's complex mathematics, and he brought the ideas into his 1966 course notes.
I was immensely enthusiastic about it and brought it into my lectures. The 66 lectures were a eureka moment for me. I had this sort of semi-poetic vision of immortal genes manipulating mortal bodies, survival machines, as I called them, and throwing them away and then marching on down the generations. It's true. It's what happens. The thing about genes is that they're potentially immortal because they're copied and copied and copied and copied identically down through countless generations, and the bodies are thrown away.
These were ideas Richard would later immortalize in The Selfish Gene. But for now, an emerging technology kept him from getting down to writing. He was still studying behavior in chicks and was swamped in statistics. What Richard needed was a way to process the data.
He was one of the very early people into the use of computers.
In those days, there was just one computer in Oxford, and you had to submit your job on punched paper tape, and then you came back the next day or maybe 2 days later and got the results, and you found a stupid mistake which you corrected, put back the paper tape and came back with another stupid mistake and so on. So it was a very laborious business. I learned how to program and became utterly intrigued by it.
Richard was then in charge of a deep animal behavior group computer, which was about the size of a room and had about the calculating power of a mobile phone, or less than a mobile phone, in fact. But Richard was one of the very early adopters.
I remember once I dreamed that I was a computer just chugging my way through, repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating, a sort of horrible nightmare of a night. And I got up very early at dawn. But anyway, the fascination of computers stayed with me.
So I can remember Richard trying to teach all of us in the animal behavior group how to write computer programs in machine code, a string of zeros and ones. So he was a real pioneer in that field, and it reflects his logical mind and I think his interest in how things work.
I became, I think the correct word would be addicted to computer programming, and the addiction became much worse when computers, following Moore's law, became smaller and faster and cheaper, and so one could have access to one's own. And then I really did become addicted and had to more or less positively cure myself of it.
Richard was not only distracted by computers. In the late 60s, he took a lecturing post at the University of California in Berkeley. It was the height of flower power, and he soon discovered a passion for campaigning.
My first wife, Marion, and I had just got married, and we went out together for a sort of adventure in our 20s. Both of us were very politically active. We got involved in the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. We got involved in the campaigning for the Democratic candidacy for the presidency. And so our old car was simply covered with electioneering posters and things. We went to demonstrations and political meetings and things, both in Berkeley and in San Francisco. And I lectured on animal behavior, and I suppose it's really a time of youth which sort of haunts one's dreams for some time afterwards.
But after 2 short years, Nico Tinbergen managed to lure Richard away from California, back to a research position at Oxford. The England he returned to could not have been more different from sunny California.
There had been fierce struggle between the police and pickets as the strikers tried to stop lorries entering and leaving.
Britain was in the grip of industrial unrest. A miners' strike in the early 70s brought Richard's computer work to a standstill.
There were constant power cuts, and it wasn't possible to do research that involved electrical apparatus. So I thought it would be a good idea if I tried to put together the ideas that had so inspired me in 1966 and write a book. And I started to write it. I wrote 2 chapters, but then the power came back on. And so I gave up the project and went back to my research.
But evolutionary thinking was moving fast. Like Bill Hamilton, who had inspired Richard in the 60s, other academics such as John Maynard Smith and Bob Trivers were also publishing papers about altruism and genes. Reading their work spurred Richard into action.
It was the advent of the Trivers papers and the Maynard Smith papers in 1971, 72, 73 and 74, which goaded me into finally getting back to taking out my first 2 chapters out of the drawer and getting down to it properly. I think I felt, yes, I think that's right now, it's coming back to me. I think those extra papers, I really felt, gosh, this has got to be, I've got to get back to that book. This is so exciting. There's so much to add. So I wrote it in quite a frenzy of energy.
The manuscript was finished in 1975. Now, it needed a title.
And I remember Richard ran a little competition amongst us, his friends and colleagues, for the title of the book. And my submission was Immortal Coils, which I think he used as one of the chapter headings, but he stuck with his own idea as the title of the book.
The title Richard chose was The Selfish Gene.
I called the book The Selfish Gene because if anything is a selfish entity maximizing its own survival, it is the gene. You don't want to talk about the selfish organism, the selfish individual, because most of the time, not most of the time, a good bit of the time, organisms are being altruistic. They're driven to be altruistic by the selfish genes.
It was this now iconic title that appealed to publisher Michael Rogers at Oxford University Press.
So Michael asked if he could see what I was working on, and I gave him some chapters. And I was phoned up and he said, "I must have that book." And he then, nothing would deter him. I mean, it was absolutely, it was sort of, I don't know what you'd call him, like a bull charging.
I started reading and I couldn't stop. It was so good and it was so brilliant, and I was completely, absolutely gripped, and I thought it was so wonderful. And from then on, I couldn't sleep for worrying that we wouldn't get the book. I wanted to publish this book because I thought it was going to be important and it was going to do really well.
The book was a huge success. Dawkins' gift for distilling ideas and communicating them had come together in one seminal piece of work.
If you have a radically new view of the world, it was a view that we are just vehicles for our genes. It's the genes' interests that matters. It's not us. And that, he showed, has all sorts of unintended consequences for the way in which we think, new consequences for the way in which we view human behavior. And it was a wonderful and radical new vision set out in sparkling prose, and above it all, this wonderful, wonderful metaphor, the selfish gene.
It revealed the logic with crystal clear precision, and that enabled people to see why natural selection must be gene-centered, why it doesn't make sense to talk about it in any other way.
Richard was, in a way, taking ideas that existed, but making us look at them in a different way, viewing them through a different window, through the window of the selfish gene. It was just the beauty of the way he expressed the ideas was absolutely riveting and, I thought, overwhelming for me, captivating, as somebody who knew a lot about the ideas but hadn't really seen them expressed in exactly that way before.
It's stunningly right, it's stunningly clear, it is the most extraordinary book.
The book was immensely popular, but it also came in for heavy criticism. Some biologists argued that the selfish gene was wrong because genes do not code for any specific characteristics of an organism.
There is no one-to-one correlation between any gene and any bit of how an organism actually operates. Many genes are involved in the expression of any feature in the organism, and each gene is involved in many, many different aspects of how an organism is. And once you don't have that one-to-one correlation, it cannot be that the gene is the unit of selection in this sort of way.
I have never, ever suggested a sort of atomistic relationship between genes and the actual form of the body and the behavior of the body and what it does. Complete nonsense, and I never said it, and I certainly don't think it and never did think it. My emphasis on genes is strictly an evolutionary emphasis, that the gene is the level in the hierarchy of life at which natural selection acts. It is the gene which survives or doesn't survive. That's my emphasis on the gene.
But the debate around the selfish gene goes beyond the argument about what genes specifically code for. Richard Dawkins' critics claim that his ideas reduce human beings to mindless agents controlled by our genes.
You can't say, as Dawkins did in The Selfish Gene, that organisms are simply lumbering robots, passive vehicles, whose only function is to help a gene transmit itself into the next generation. This gene-centered, gene metaphor way of describing the world is what I would call genetic determinism, what many people call genetic determinism.
Genetic determinism is the notion that if there is, in quotes, a gene for altruism or another gene for another kind of behavior, somehow that means that the genes determine everything in our bodies and the way we are, and we have no liberty to change things, no free will.
It's the idea that our genes rule the show. If we have a natural disposition to be nasty, then we'll be nasty whatever, and there's nothing that we can do about it. This is a deep, deep misunderstanding. There is absolutely nothing fixed about our behavior. Look around us, we can see that it's not fixed. We can see that we respond in different ways.
genetics and Darwinism had always had a dark side. Natural selection had long appealed to those who wanted to use it as a justification for weeding out the less fit members of society.
Not all mental deficiency is hereditary, but heredity accounts for more of the mild, feeble-minded types, such as you see in this group of men exercising in the grounds of the institution. If carefully trained, they can be taught simple routine tasks. But it would have been better by far for them and for the rest of the community if they had never been born. If we want to maintain the race at a high level, physically and mentally, everybody sound in body and mind should marry and have enough children to perpetuate their stock and carry on the race.
Post-World War II, eugenics had fallen from favour. But in the 70s, extremist groups like the National Front perpetuated the notion of racial purity. They seized on the selfish gene as an intellectual defence of their ideas.
A warm review appeared in the journal published by the National Front.
One result of kin selection is a tendency to identify with individuals physically resembling oneself and to be nasty to individuals different in appearance.
Dawkins hit back against what he saw as the political hijacking of his work.
Some people completely misunderstood what's implied by a book I wrote called The Selfish Gene. On the right, we had various writers from the National Front and French equivalents who saw the idea of the selfish gene as chiming in very much with their own rather nasty political philosophy. On the left, on the other hand, I remember being blamed in a magazine article by one influential left-wing writer, almost personally blamed for the election of Mrs. Thatcher in the last general election.
Though the selfish gene was conceived in the halcyon days of the 60s, it hit the zeitgeist in the 80s. Many still see it as a justification for a greedy, self-serving society.
During the 1980s, Thatcherism, free market economics, what I call selfish capitalism, was in urgent need of some kind of profound intellectual justification, a deeper argument to justify it. And it's interesting that The Selfish Gene didn't become a best-selling book, one that was read widely by the public rather than just by a few academics, until the 1980s. During that time, it was interpreted as suggesting that it's natural to be selfish, that it seemed to be a justification for the idea that greed is good.
When Margaret Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as society, they're only individuals and families, she was, if you like, endorsing the claim of the gene myth, that what matters is not the social organisation in which we're embedded, what matters is actually only the individuals, their genes and their genetic relationships.
People have used it and taken it as a philosophical justification for extreme right-wing politics. What is your answer to that?
To the extent that natural selection is politically unpleasant, which it actually rather is. I mean, if you were to live your life as though you were constantly aiming for Darwinian success, then the political world which that would result in would be a very unpleasant world, with the strong oppressing the downtrodden. We can emancipate ourselves politically by saying, I want to live in a kind of society which is very far from Darwinian natural selection. I'm a passionate Darwinian who believes that it's Darwinian natural selection that's given us our bodies and our brains. But I also believe that our brains have become big enough that we can rebel against that.
Although the book argues this case, Dawkins has never entirely rid himself of the accusation that his book was a defense of selfishness.
it is a lesson that sometimes people will read a book by title only and omit to read the rather large footnote, which is the book itself. The book could have been called something like The Selfish Gene and the Altruistic Individual, or even just The Altruistic Individual. That would have been a bit long.
Do you think if you'd have called it something else, we'd still be talking about it 35 years later?
I like to think that the book itself has certain merits which might have caused it to be being talked about. Yes, I think I'm kind of talking myself round to thinking perhaps that the title was a mistake.
But for Richard Dawkins, the disputes around the selfish gene are also a lesson in the importance of scientific freedom.
You cannot govern science by saying if it's suggesting something to you that's politically or morally or emotionally unpleasant, therefore it mustn't be allowed to be true. The great John Maynard Smith once satirized a left-wing scientist who was objecting to some scientific principle on grounds that it was unpleasant, more or less just that, politically unpleasant. And John Maynard Smith said, "What should we have done? Falsify the equations? Of course you can't do that. Of course you can't subvert your science by just twisting it to be politically acceptable. You have to report the science the way it is. But then you can say, and let's not run our politics like that."
Richard Dawkins followed up the success and controversy of The Selfish Gene with The Extended Phenotype, an academic book, which explained gene-centered natural selection in more detail. But it was his next book, The Blind Watchmaker, which would set the stage for his role as a defender of science against the claims of creationists.
The Blind Watchmaker was a book about the argument from design and what's wrong with it. And it seemed to me a very natural place to go. The Selfish Gene had already dealt with the topics of the Selfish Gene. There was nothing more I wanted to say about that. And so the next obvious thing was the widespread skepticism about evolution.
Creationists believe that the complexity of nature can only be explained by the work of a creator. The concept is called intelligent design, and in the 80s, the creationist movement was gathering support.
For over 100 years, science has told us that human beings are a chance product of a mindless process, evolution. But as the human future gets bleaker, so more and more people are turning from the cold analysis of science to the apparent certainties of religion.
I'm no kin to the monkey, no, no, no. The monkey's no kin to me. I don't know much about his ancestors, but mine didn't swing from a tree. It seems so unbelievable, and yet they're saying it's true.
A new battle for the literal truth of Genesis is being fought out on the campuses of American high schools. It's an attack on what's being taught in science classes. Kelly Seagraves is a fundamentalist Christian with 3 children at school. Earlier this year, he took his battle with the school authorities into the law courts.
We believe in the home and in our church that God created man as man. Now, I send my son to school and I tell him that, you know, you're going to get an education here and I want you to listen to the teacher. Then I find that the teacher's teaching things in opposition to our faith.
In the book and the TV version of The Blind Watchmaker, Richard Dawkins led the charge against what he sees as the false scientific claims of creationism, like the idea that men and dinosaurs walked the earth together.
These two have been interpreted as a man's 2 feet standing together. This one is a very large foot with the big toe there and the other toes going around here and here. Although why Cretaceous man should have stood with his legs like that requires a little bit of explaining. These are the kinds of slight, unimpressive resemblances that can be produced by chance alone, by the random forces of physics alone. But there are things in the world, living organisms, you and me, that are so complicated they are vastly too improbable to have been brought about by chance alone.
Dawkins became a tireless promoter of evolution, arguing the case that only natural selection could produce such complexity.
This is a flatfish, a halibut. Its ancestors once swam normally in the water like a normal fish does, like that. But the ancestors of the halibut settled down on the bottom of the sea, one side down. But when it did that, the ancestor found that one of its eyes was looking straight into the sand. Only the other one was looking up. And so gradually in evolution, the other eye, the one that was looking into the sand, migrated round the side of the head and came up to the top. Now, anybody who was going to design a flatfish wouldn't do it that way.
For Dawkins, this kind of adaptation is key evidence for evolution. And an insistence upon evidence defines his thinking. In a 2003 book of essays, Dawkins even published a letter he had written to his daughter Juliet, stressing the value of critical thinking.
Next time somebody tells you something that sounds important, think to yourself, is this the kind of thing that people probably know because of evidence? Or is it the kind of thing that people only believe because of tradition, authority, or revelation? And next time somebody tells you that something is true, why not say to them, what kind of evidence is there for that? And if they can't give you a good answer, I hope you'll think very carefully before you believe a word they say. I was trying to tell her how to think about certain things, not what to think, but how to think. And I was trying to encourage her always to demand evidence. So we know something only when there's evidence for it. And I was particularly trying to warn her, trying to guard her against various wrong ways of thinking that you know something, such as tradition. You should never say, our people have always believed X, so you should believe X. Authority. You should never say, Professor so-and-so believes X, therefore you should believe X. Or your priest believes X, so you should believe X. Or revelation. I have this inner conviction that X is true, therefore you should believe X. No, the only reason you should believe X is that there's evidence for X.
It is ultimately this passionate belief in the importance of evidence which has fueled Richard Dawkins' most controversial role as an outspoken advocate of atheism. In 2006, he published The God Delusion, a polemic against religion. It became his fastest-selling book and pitted him head-to-head with the religious establishment.
Richard's really had two careers. His career as a very successful writer on evolutionary biology. I mean, the most influential figure of his generation, I would say, in broader public terms, and one of the most influential in the scientific community. But then he's had this other career as a promulgator of a proselytizer for atheism, which I think stems very much from the same kind of logical clarity of thought that he's used in his biological work to say, well, what actually does it boil down to? What is religious belief trying to explain?
Dawkins sees this militant opposition to religion as a natural progression from his scientific roots.
Right from certainly before the time I wrote The Selfish Gene, I have been every bit as militant an atheist as I ever became. And the perception of The God Delusion as a militant book is really because it is a book that's all about religion. And my other books only touched on religion peripherally, but if you look at The Selfish Gene, you'll find phrases which are just as militant as anything you'll find in The God Delusion. It's just that that wasn't a book about religion, whereas The God Delusion is.
Richard Dawkins has campaigned tirelessly to promote science over religion.
Religion is part of a complex of supernatural beliefs that are founded on lack of evidence, and astrology, homeopathy, all sorts of things like that. And it could be said that some of these are harmless. I don't think it's harmless. There is something insidious about training children to believe things for which there's no evidence. And so an uncritical, kind of too open-minded, so open-minded your brains fall out attitude is a great pity, because it means you miss such a lot. And merely to say that religion is harmless isn't good enough.
And he has taken every opportunity to publicly attack religion in the strongest terms.
The God of the Old Testament has got to be the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Lord Jacobowitz is an educated man. He knows perfectly well the world was not created in 6 days. There is nothing special about the Bible.
Yes. Richard gives definitive answers to things, and if you don't like those answers, you're going to find it controversial, you're not going to like him.
I'm rather less interested in what people think than in what's true. The human brain is extremely good at making things up. The age of the Earth, 5,000 years, I mean, that is, I'm sorry, Rabbi, that is ridiculous.
People find him argumentative because he doesn't suffer fools gladly, and he is rapier-like in his ability to pick up a hole in your argument. And some people find that uncomfortable.
I'm looking for God.
Well, which God? I mean, why not Jupiter? Why not Zeus? Why not Thor?
You're a Taurian, you have great gravitas, you find change anathema. You're Venus ruled, that's why you've got those rather lovely kissy lips. Honour your time.
Richard Dawkins, where would you put astrology on the scale of belief?
Somewhere among fairies.
What if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. What if you're wrong about the great juju at the bottom of the sea? Nobody not brought up in the faith could reach any verdict other than barking mad.
Sir, there could be many things that you know well. There are other things that you don't know well. But please, in the process of it, don't be arrogant.
Many of Dawkins' critics believe that their own spiritual experiences are proof enough of God's existence, and that Dawkins treats their faith with a lack of respect.
I think they should grow thicker skins. I mean, we all have to bear satire on whatever it is, our political views, and if politicians sort of started blubbing every time somebody drew a satirical cartoon of them or something, they'd never get anywhere in politics. There's no reason why religion should be regarded as particularly vulnerable to satire and should be handled with kid gloves any more than politics.
But a powerful argument against Dawkins is that he does not appreciate the deeply consoling role religion plays in human life.
Science and religion are performing very, very different roles. They're setting themselves very different questions, and they have very, very different ways of answering them. What religion does is generate narrative structures. We're storytelling animals. That's what human beings are. They need stories. And the thing about religions is that they all have lots of stories, and I think those stories are about helping human beings to find meaning and value and purpose, and to come to terms with the seemingly arbitrary nature of human experience.
I can see why you might want to find something consoling. I can see why you might want consolation. I can see why you might want to take a drug that consoles you, or why you might go and cry on a friendly shoulder and get patted and hugged and get consolation from that. But to believe that something is the case, when you have no more reason to think it's the case than that it is consoling, I mean, that is just fatuous. That's ridiculous and illogical. If it's bleak, too bad. I mean, why should it be anything other than bleak? I mean, there's no caring about the universe. Why should there be? Why should the universe care about what happens to us? But we can make our own world. We can make our own purposes, our own warmth, our own affections, our own loves, and we can lead a life that's anything but bleak.
We gaze up at the stars on a dark night with no moon and no city lights, and breathless with joy we say the sight is pure magic. In this sense, magical simply means deeply moving, exhilarating, something that gives us goosebumps, something that makes us feel more fully alive.
Richard Dawkins' evangelical stance has made him one of the most recognizable faces in science. He has sold 5 million books and regularly packs out venues around the world. But all of this may have come at a cost.
Richard has become almost a household phrase. You see it in leaders in the broadsheet newspapers. They refer to Dawkins or Dawkinsization or something like that. So it's almost become, I don't think he's quite in the Oxford English Dictionary yet, but it's almost at that level. Yet Richard himself is actually quite a shy and retiring person in many ways. I suspect he probably finds it quite stressful to be continually on public platforms as he is.
And whilst many revere him, he has also faced very personal criticism. His email inbox has at times been flooded with hate mail.
People regard any attack on their religion almost as though I'm saying they've got an ugly face or something. It's a personal attack on them. And I think that they feel cornered. And so they lash out with personal attacks, what amount to personal dislike.
So, given the hostility he faces, what drives Richard Dawkins to continue as the outspoken public figure he has become?
Richard keeps on going. I mean, his messages about evolution, his messages about religion are very well articulated and have been presented many times, but Richard keeps on going. And one might wonder why that is, what drives him. I think it's passion and it's belief that he has got an important message to put across.
The true understanding, the scientific understanding of the nature of existence is so utterly fascinating. How could you not want people to share it? Carl Sagan, I think, said, when you're in love, you want to tell the world. And who, on understanding a scientific view of reality, would not, as it were, fall in love and want to tell the world?
And at the age of 70, he shows no sign of giving up on his desire to understand the wonders of the universe and communicate them to others.
Different people have different ways of responding to the thought that they're very lucky to be alive. For me, it seems to suggest a great responsibility to make the most of it. I mean, extremely lucky to be here. The odds against your being here are far greater than the odds against your winning the lottery. So be thankful and spend your time, your brief time, under the sun, looking around and rejoicing and wondering and being fascinated and trying to understand everything about the universe in which you're so fortunate to be born.
It's all too beautiful. It's all too beautiful.
Our brand new series, The King and the Playwright, continues here on BBC4 on Monday at 9. And coming up next tonight, another gem from the back catalogues of Parky and his interviews with David Niven.
That's where I've been. What did you do there? I got high. What did you feel?